Welcome to the third episode of me discussing Bande, Dessinée comics that have a relation to any of the regions I've lived in. And today we're going to talk about Tintin and Flight 714 to Sydney. The original title was just Flight 14, which makes sense to me because, spoilers, they never end up in Sydney. And them not making it to Sydney is not too much of a spoiler because, to be honest, that doesn't matter to the story. The story is about something else, and we're going to dive into that. But before that, I want to explain a little bit more about Sydney and why I picked this one. Obviously, because of the title and the intention to go to Sydney in this book. I spent most of my time in Australia, in Sydney, and I loved it. It was my early mid-20s. That I spent 1 year in Australia, and I traveled along the East Coast for about 3 months and stayed for most of my year in Sydney, and then from there went to Melbourne and back to Sydney, and then through the outback, Singapore, and back to Germany. But I love this country. I love Australia. I love Sydney. I still have some contact to some folks over there, even though that's by now 15 to 20 years ago. Holy crap, time flies. But yes, Australia is a great country. Not only the cities, but the coasts, obviously, the outback. And other than the poisonous animals, there's nothing you wouldn't love about Australia. I was very excited to read this. A little bit disappointed that they didn't actually land in Australia. But yes, other than that, I'll attempt a spoiler-free review of the story. That was the second to last story written by Hergé. But the story was written in 1966. And now that the sun is coming out, because it's mostly sunny in Australia, it's right on theme, it was written and serialized in 1966, 1967. But Hergé, obviously, he created Tintin in 1929. So definitely the first of the forefathers or grandfathers or however you want to call the Bande, Dessinée originators. Not the first French guy to create a comic, but for this purpose, yes, Tintin is the first of the modern Bande, Dessinée comic strips. So this story obviously is written a few years prior to anyone getting to the moon, the first man on the moon. So in this book, Tintin and the gang is referred to as the first men on the moon. Obviously based on the prior episode, the two-part story arc of Destination Moon and Explorers to the Moon. And so they're celebrated as the first men on the moon before anyone was actually on the moon. It's like a historical component that I love in a time prior to the moon landing. So a little bit less than the other books. You still get the premise. So you have the Flight 417, a Qantas Boeing 707 touches down at Kemajoran Airport, Djakarta. Flight 714 from London arrives in Java, last stop before Sydney, Australia. And we are basically at a layover that our protagonists start their story in. So we have obviously Tintin, Snowy, the professor, and the captain. They are all invited to the International Astronautical Congress in Sydney because, again, they were the first men on the moon. And they meet this millionaire, Mr. Carreidas, at the airport in Djakarta, who invites them to join them on his plane, his personal plane. His assistant then hijacks the plane and lands it on a small island where none other than Mr. Rastapopoulos awaits them. This is Robert Rastapopoulos' last appearance in Tintin comics, by the way, which is funny because his first appearance was in the second comic, and his last appearance is the second to last comic. But that's where the premise ends for me because I don't want to create spoilers. It definitely gets magical or extraterrestrial in the end. You have Tintin, Captain Haddock, Professor Calculus and the pilot who get arrested, get locked in a bunker, and the main part, or the twist of the story, if you will, happens on that island, but I'm not going to spoil it for you. Unfortunately, they will never get to Sydney, which is a bummer. There's no other Bande Dessinée comic I know of that actually is in Australia. If you know of any, please let me know. I would love to read it. It's very difficult to find any comics that are set in Australia. It's such a lovely country. This story is well written, has great art. It's a historical piece from before mankind landed on the moon, and it shows in the story. Again, the whole premise is based on that. You get the classic slapstick humor with the professor being confused and not understanding and creating complete confusion amongst everyone involved. It's as hilarious as ever. You got the arch nemesis involved in this. What else can you ask for? And you got some extraterrestrial elements. The art and the storytelling being more realistic than the other two, than Lucky Luke or Asterix, as Tintin has always been. A little bit more realistic about this group of friends heading out, going on adventures. Tintin being the good guy, the good-natured, positive, curious boy that he is with his dog Snowy. The confused professor creating a slapstick comedic element, and Captain Haddock, obviously, with his grumpy personality, always bringing this extra spice into his story that otherwise wouldn't be there. But that's it for this month. Flight 714 to Sydney. The reference to Australia in the title. That's where it ends. Nevertheless, check out the entire TinTin series. It's out of those 4 titles that I picked, the only one that is concluded. So there are no more TinTin comics. Hergé created it, and the series basically died with him, if you will, while Asterix, Blake and Mortimer, Lucky Luke are being continued by other writers and artists to this day, and new ones being released, such as what we're going to look at next month, 8 Hours in Berlin. That just came out last year. It's a brand new story about Blake and Mortimer, and see you next month.